good.
BBC Radio London.
Now then, it's very interesting, isn't it, talking about loneliness, especially working for a radio station, because for many people, the radio station, and I know particularly this radio station, is a friend. And when you have a friend, you're less lonely. So research has now found that more than 3 million people who live in Britain are chronically lonely. So what is the difference then between being alone and being lonely? Why do so many of us feel lonely even when we have busy, active social lives living in a very busy metropolis? How can we really connect when there is so much in technology and digital? Human connection seems to be becoming less and less. Well, Simone Heng looks at this subject in her book, Let's Talk About Loneliness. And I'm so pleased to say Simone joins me on the afternoon show. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. And you know, it is really interesting, this subject, because I made a little documentary for the BBC on a strand called Inside Out about 4 years ago, talking about loneliness. And radio, and particularly local radio, is a friend, you know, and for some people, this is their companionship, this is their world, and it's something to tune into every day. So from what I gathered from, you know, chatting to people and interviewing people who put their hand up and said, I'm alone, and a lot of the time I'm lonely, they loved a routine. They loved something that they could look forward to, even if it meant just turning on a radio show. Do you understand that?
Well, I was actually a radio DJ for 20 years in Dubai and Singapore, and it's to do with the intimacy of radio as well. It's that you're speaking in the singular. We don't, you know, as radio DJs, you're not taught to say, hey, everyone out there, we're speaking to that one person. And it's just so intimate. And I think that helps people. I think generally we can link loneliness to many different mental health issues. And so what we know for people who are kind of low is that having something to look forward to in general, whether that be your radio show, I mean, that's important.
Having you know, expectations for the rest of the week, knowing that you've got to be somewhere or you're going to meet someone. It's very interesting, this statistic that I read out, especially you always think, you know, London, and we know this, London is a busy, thriving hub, but you're either in the party or out of the party. And if you're not in the party, you can often feel more lonely watching the party carry on without you, can't you?
Yeah, I think it's very, very possible to be feeling alone in a room full of people. And what's interesting, when you talk about London, I live in Singapore, but I've also lived in places like Dubai, where that party that we're talking about in these kind of cosmopolitan metropolises exists. And what's interesting is you can actually find that the connection can be quite shallow and transactional. And that actually makes us feel more lonely. You'll find that if you're surrounded by people that might not share your value system, you don't feel fully seen, that can actually augment your loneliness.
Gosh, that's so interesting, isn't it? I think that's happened to all. It's happened to me where you've gone to a soiree or you've gone to some, you know, I don't know, some finger buffet deal, and you're chatting away and no one really gets you, and you just think, am I an alien amongst these?
Yeah, it's avatars. You feel like, oh, they're projecting an avatar of them, and our avatars are talking to each other, but I'm not fully feeling connected and I'm not satiated. And I think that is something now with the advent of social media. You know, Gen Z are the loneliest generation according to a 2018 study. And that has to do with, I think, the proliferation of being raised maybe on the iPad and wanting connection, but then different from my generation, your generation, not having the social skills fluently to get yourself out of that mess. So this is a topic we have to talk about now so that they can have some tools and have some knowledge, exactly what we're talking about.
And I think added to that, that generation also went through the pandemic for 2 years, where you literally were removed physically from other people, you know?
Yes.
It's very well someone of my age, because we all just thought, oh, well, this is rather nice, actually. It's a quieter moment. You know, I'm not being superficial, but it was, you know, you think, oh, well, I don't have to go out every night. I've got the perfect alibi, you know? It's lockdown. But for those people who are in their adolescence or youth, when you're learning social skills and
when you're finding out what your identity is,
and nurturing friendships, which, okay, a friendship online is not the same as meeting your mate and going, let's have a day in Brighton and let's go and do this and let's walk around the shops. It's not the same, is it?
And with the scientific research, there's no decent scientific research to show us that the same dopamine, oxytocin levels we get from in-person connection that we get them from connecting online. So your digital connections are a way station. They are not the destination. And so for people, I'm a late millennial, your generation, we know that. But what's interesting with Gen Z, some are not aware of that. So you can imagine you're just connecting online limitlessly. And it's never resulting in that in-person connection that releases those chemicals that helps to bring down the fight or flight response that's triggered by chronic loneliness.
And so what happens then? Sorry, I don't want this to be too bleak, but if that's the situation, because having empathy with someone, when your friends come to you with problems, with issues and something, you say, come around, let's sit and go through this. If online, nothing's real, really, because you're just the words you're typing you're censoring everything by type. It's not coming out of your mouth, is it? It's whatever you put on a iPad or phone or whatever is censored because you're typing it letter by letter. It's not a natural reaction.
And there's hours in between the answers sometimes.
There's hours between, and so there is. You've made a really good point in that in later life, when you have your own children, when the children have issues, when you're juggling family life and work life and everything, where does your empathy, how can you empathize organically if all you've ever done is write reactions on a pad or a screen?
Well, the most troubling I see with what's shared about connection online, so the research in chapter 2 of the book is all about the 5 kinds of connection we need. And what's troubling for me when I see on Instagram and that is that people are saying, if this kind of connection can't give you everything you need, cut them off. Or there's a mythology that you need to get all of your love and connection from one human. And that's not true. So the 5 types, which might blow people's mind across all the different research and studies, number 1 is micro connections. These are the things we took for granted before the pandemic, like just nodding to your barista, getting a cup of coffee, or smiling, or, I don't know, patting someone on the back for doing a good job. You need micro connections. You need relational connection. This is in your community, a bit deeper than the micro ones. These are people that you could call on. For example, I'm a single woman, and sometimes like a light bulb might go out and I'm too short to reach it, and I might be able to call a neighbour to come and help me put the light bulb in. You need relational connection. It makes you feel part of a social fabric. We need intimate connection. This one's really important. These are it's about 5 people, according to an evolutionary anthropologist. These are 5 people that you can truly be yourself, warts and all, and they still love you. Now, what's troubling is a lot of Gen Zs don't know what that feels like, the depth of that. You need self-connection. So this is where you talk about, you're talking about people, how do you get time to get empathy? Well, that starts with self-connection. If you're so busy that you can't find your own head and your own toe, you're not going to be able to produce empathy, which comes when we're calm. So self-connection is really, really, really important. And then, oh my gosh, my jet-lagged brain from Singapore is now trying to remember the
I'm
last
still
kind
taking
of...
on those 4, though, because that's a hell of a lot of fodder to think about, truly.
Yeah.
It really is. Because if you think, you talking about, going back to empathy, I feel so sorry. I'm picking on a generation, but this whole thing, I do so much on mindfulness on this show, people coming in talking about wellness, mindfulness, whatever. But this whole thing about cut all the people who are toxic out of your life.
Yes.
And you're just saying, hang on a moment, these can be your friends. They may not be absolutely full of joy and glee, but you don't just cut people out if they're not in a particularly good place, do you? And you just think, isn't life? You deal with that. You don't label it as toxic and say, well, you're not bringing me the good vibes, so go away.
Yes, and life is long. And by the way, we should, and always, there are so many fantastic things about Gen Z that they teach me so much because they have really good boundaries.
And I think they're kind. I do think they're kind. And I think, me sitting here, they don't see age. I do other work with that generation who just see me as what I am. And I just think, God, when I was your age, I wouldn't sit with a 68-year-old and have anything to say. But they don't see it. They just So their parents have done a really good job, because I don't think they're as bigoted. I don't think, they have as many isms.
And they're very compassionate.
They're very compassionate. But, and I hate saying this, their mental health is quite fragile. And I mean, this is a generalization, I know. But for my generation, there was no mental health. There was no such word, 2 words as mental health. It was like, they're odd, they're a bit odd, give them a wide berth, or I'm depressed. That was it. That was about it.
Yeah.
No one ever gave you the benefit of having mental health issues or even thinking about mental health. It was not there. This is post-war, I'm thinking, where people were just saying, you're lucky you're alive. You're lucky that you've got 2 parents putting dinner on the table. Do you know what I mean? It was.
Oh yeah, I grew up with Asian immigrant parents. I mean, we don't even have time for that conversation. But do you know what the antidote to fragility is resilience, right? And human connection helps us become more resilient. It literally
of course it does, yeah.
lowers the stress response, and it tells the brain, hey, I've got more resources to survive whatever adversity I'm going through. So if there's already a fragility and then there's no human connection, or there's reduced human connection, we're going to have a powder keg, which is why the UK has a Minister for Loneliness, along with Korea, along with Japan. And then the US Surgeon General just dropped a massive advisory that's been covered all over the States. Loneliness epidemic is global now. So it's amazing that we're talking about this, and we're talking about this because we want that generation to be happy and healthy.
So okay, we've said it exists globally on epidemic levels. Will the people that we're discussing, would they admit to being lonely? Is the first thing to admit to it? And can someone appear lonely, or can they disguise it very, very easily? So is it difficult to get to?
I love that you've said this, because if we look at some of the most famous people in Hollywood, like Marilyn Monroe, for example, looked like they had everything and were deeply lonely. And I'm a 39-year-old single woman, and I live in Asia where everyone looks 12, so the dating pool for me is hard. And I feel incredibly Bridget Jones some nights, but because of how I present, because I, can put on some good fake eyelashes and
wonderful clothes.
Bless, thank you. Oh, your
Great
Instagram
haircut.
is everything.
Sorry.
And there's an assumption that if you're a person that has it all together, that you're not lonely, and we now know that's not true. Leadership, for example, people in leadership is one of the loneliest things to be in.
I bet, yeah.
Because, for example, entrepreneurs, tech companies, if it's a startup, they hire all their best mates from university to be part of their startup team. And then when things go wrong, they cannot disclose that vulnerability because all of their friends are taking a paycheck from them.
Yeah.
That leadership role is, I hear it over and over again, it's incredibly lonely for them.
Yeah.
So I think we should look at this, similar to the pandemic, as a unifying global experience that regardless of how we show up or present, we've all felt. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude, of course, right? So you can have...
of course, yeah, absolutely.
Solitude is being alone by choice. And then loneliness on an incidental level is just the body's alarm to go out and connect. But it's that chronic loneliness that you read about in that statistic. That's the one that damages us over time.
Well, I was going to say, how does it manifest itself? What are the symptoms, and what do you do when you're that lonely?
Yeah, you'll have less than good sleep. There's a lady called Dr. Louise Hawkley that studies micro-awakenings as a marker of loneliness. So that if you had during the pandemic those little less than good sleep, that was a marker. It all goes back to our days evolving in tribes. So if you were cast out of the tribe, more likely to be killed off by a saber-toothed tiger or not be able to get food for yourself. And so you would die more quickly. So your body would go into survival mode. So today, when we perceive we're not getting enough connection that we want, same survival mode happens. Incidental level, fine. It's an alarm. Ching, ching, go out, make friends, not on your phone. Do that stuff that gives you those soothing hormones, oxytocin, dopamine. But if you have it every day and you're waking up with it every single day, you're going to have... For example, it can manifest as outbursts, misreading of social cues, a yearning to want to be around people, but the minute you are invited, a huge anxiety. And how it shows up for me particularly, I know when I'm feeling lonely, is that I hold my friends to a higher standard than is necessary. Then it creates...
a lot of people do that, and they probably don't
and
actually
they push
realise
people
what
away.
they're doing. Yes.
And then it creates a loop. So what we know is the lonely brain is not rational. So it will loop to isolate you. And that's why I wrote the book, Let's Talk About Loneliness, to cut through so that anyone walking a bookshelf, I might cry a bit now when is going to see that very confrontational title, and it's going to hopefully cut through that irrational lonely brain, and they're going to pick it up.
And also drug taking and drinking just to feel happier probably is a huge temptation, isn't it? Just to make yourself feel normal. Just comforting and soothing. So there's that as well. Do you admit that you've been lonely for a large part of your life?
The worst loneliness I experienced was I left my radio job in Dubai to go back and care for my mum. And culturally, as an Asian woman, you're taught I was taught from the time that I was young that if something happens to either of the parents, you must give up your life. And I never questioned it. And so I gave up my whole social network of people my age to go back and care for my mother. And it was at a time I was 30, so all my friends were getting married. I didn't want to be the Debbie Downer at the dinner. And then the lonely brain started looping for me into no other person your age can have a dead dad and a mother in a wheelchair and no one can understand you. So then it was telling me to isolate further. And my mother also had hoarding disorder, just to lean, and it's all in the book, just to lean in this idea of, mental health disorders. So I was cleaning her hoard for 6 months on my own. And I completely lost any self-connection, any identity. And that really helped to trigger the research that I do now, because it was like internal torture.
Did you know but having said that, there are so many of our listeners who are in the situation you've just described, who call me. I do a late show at night because they have a bit of time to themselves because they're caring for their parents. So there are people who will connect totally with what you're saying. Is your mum still with us? Has she passed?
She is still with us, and she's in Australia, and that's why I'm now based in Singapore, so I can fly much more often than if I lived in Dubai.
Geographically, you've moved away from her. I
think the big lesson I learned too is that you cannot give up your life for one human connection. Finding out about those types, part of the passion behind that research of me going through all of the studies written about human connection to see where the common ground was in the types of connection, was because I was like, well, I did what my culture told me to do.
Yeah.
And it made me feel awful.
Yeah.
So what do I not know?
What an interesting scenario. And there's so much I want to ask you. Has your mum dealt with that? That you are now in literally a different country to her?
So I only moved after she lost cognition.
Right, okay.
Right, yeah.
But it's so interesting, isn't it? Because your generation, you won't feel like that about your children, being your carer. It's so
not at all.
No,
yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Gosh, we've run out of time. What an interesting book. So it's called Let's Talk About Loneliness. We've been speaking to Simone Heng, and it's out now. The book is out now.
It is out now I just saw Waterstones, Piccadilly has it. It's all of the retailers.
With a really good publisher. It's published by Hay House, very good publisher. And Simone has a website, which is Simone Heng, spelt HENG.com. Simone Heng. Social media at Simone Heng. I'm certainly going to start following you. And are you working as a jock now? Where are you?
So I'm in Singapore. I actually work as a speaker on human connection, and this is how it started, and the book was to support that. So like you, that idea of being on stage and speaking was the first love, and the book was this happy accident.
I think you're amazing. You come in here
like
a little
you're
dynamite.
Amazing.
No, not
are we
at all.
the same height?
I think we probably
we are.
But I'm wearing Jimmy Choos. So I'm looking a bit. I'm probably even shorter. How tall are you?
I'm 152 centimeters, 5'1".
We're exactly the same height.
I know, but you're much smaller bone than me. I saw you in those beautiful JW Anderson slides on Instagram. I was like, look at her beautiful small ankles.
Yeah, I have got tiny ankles, but I've got the biggest rib cage. I'm certainly going to seek out your Instagram. And I would advise anybody who's dealing with loneliness at the moment to read the book or go to any of your talks. Are you going to be talking over in this country at any point?
I am in October.
Come back on the show. Come back on the show. I find you absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank
the name
you.
is Simone Heng, everybody. And I thank Simone Heng for a fantastic chat. What an amazing person. And the book is called Let's Talk About Loneliness. Sometimes people come in here and it's like I've met a soulmate. Not just that she's 5'1", but literally her energy and her life and her take on life. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. So yes, well worth following her on Instagram, and also, as I say, getting hold of her book, which is with a great publisher, which is Hay Publishing. So yeah. Wow. Oh, it's almost the end of the show.